Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. There's something I never thought I'd be saying in this context, that's for sure. Today I'm going to read with you the first half of our main text for this unit that we'll be studying. It's called Living Like Weasels by Annie Dillard. If you haven't already viewed the unit guide that was available for you to look at in last week's Canvas module, I would pause this and go take a look at that so that you have an idea of the kind of essential questions, topics, themes, etc. that are going to come up in these pieces that we read. It could make this process easier for you as we're reading along together. The other thing that I would recommend is that you print yourself a hard copy of this essay that I'm about to start reading. I know it's convenient to have everything online now, but I think it would be most helpful for you to kind of go old school and print yourself a hard copy of the essay that we'll be reading. That way you can have your pen, pencil, you can be underlining, taking notes, etc. There is going to be an assignment or two that goes along with this essay, so I might be pointing out things that are worth you writing down to make those assignments easier. Okay, so basically my plan is just to read through right now about the first half of this essay or so, and then I'll be recording and uploading the second half as a separate video. That way it's kind of shorter, bite-sized pieces for you to view, but both videos should already be uploaded in this week's module for you to watch at your convenience. So let's go ahead and get started reading. Again, if you want to pause this quickly to print yourself a hard copy, I highly recommend that. Otherwise, let's go ahead and get started. This is Living Like Weasels by Annie Dillard. And before we get started, I know weasels are not a sexy kind of animal. I'm not particularly excited as a reader when I see that title. Maybe if it were Living Like Dolphins or Butterflies or I don't know, almost anything else, right? But it leaves me a little bit curious as the reader as to what kind of an argument she's going to make here. What does she mean by this, right? Living like weasels. We'll see. Here we go. A weasel is wild. Who knows what he thinks? He sleeps in his underground den, his tail draped over his nose. Sometimes he lives in his den for 2 days without leaving. We've gone longer than that now, right? Outside, he stalks rabbits, mice, muskrats, and birds, killing more bodies than he can eat warm, and often dragging the carcasses home. Obedient to instinct, he bites his prey at the neck, either splitting the jugular vein at the throat or crunching the brain at the base of the skull, and he does not let go. All right, so first she said, weasels are wild. However, after reading this description of their behavior, I'm coming up with some other adjectives too. Pause and think. What other adjectives are you coming up with if you had to describe how a weasel is? I'm thinking savage, violent, right? This is not something that I'd necessarily want as a pet. So living like weasels maybe requires us to be a little savage, right? All right, continuing on. One naturalist refused to kill a weasel who was socketed into his hand deeply as a rattlesnake. The man could in no way pry the tiny weasel off, and he had to walk half a mile to water, the weasel dangling from his palm, and soak him off like a stubborn label. Okay, so we shifted to just the weasel to a human's interaction with the weasel. And compared to the weasel's behavior, I think Annie Dillard is trying to point out that we humans are a little wussy. Maybe we're a little bit too moral or good or even afraid and fearful, right? You have this weasel who's lunging at things and killing them faster than he can eat them, right? But then you have the human who has a weasel literally stuck to his hand, like the weasel bit down and won't let go. And the guy cannot bring himself to pry the weasel off, maybe for fear of hurting the weasel, maybe it just freaks him out too much, right? And so he's going to travel half a mile with this thing hanging from his hand to hopefully let the water run and get the weasel off his hand, right? We have this, juxtaposition here. We see the contrast between the behavior of the weasel, savage, instinctual, violent, right? And then the behavior of this human that's perhaps a little absurd, right? It seems absurd to be that afraid to do the thing, to pull the weasel off. So we see how we're perhaps different beings, right? And how we act in our behavior. Continuing on. This is starting paragraph 2. And once, says Ernest Thompson Seton, once a man shot an eagle out of the sky. He examined the eagle and found the dry skull of a weasel fixed by the jaws to his throat. The supposition is that the eagle had pounced on the weasel, and the weasel swiveled and bit as instinct taught him, tooth to neck, and nearly won. I would like to have seen that eagle from the air a few weeks or months before it was shot. Was the whole weasel still attached to his feathered throat, a fur pendant? Or did the eagle eat what he could reach, gutting the live weasel with his talons before his breast, bending his beak, cleaning the beautiful airborne bones? So, some more viciousness on this weasel's part, right? Bites the eagle, will not let go. Even as presumably the eagle, who's still alive and flying about, tried to get the weasel off and ended up killing the weasel somehow. So even in a fight for the death, this weasel is not letting go, right? So there's another maybe adjective that we can come up with for how a weasel lives. Intense, committed, right? Dedicated. So living like weasels, and maybe that's what she means. She wants us to live more that way. Something to think about, right? All right, moving on. I have been reading about weasels because I saw one last week. I startled a weasel who startled me, and we exchanged a long glance. So here we finally see this first person pronoun I making its debut. So we see Dillard, the narrator, bringing in her viewpoints and some of her thoughts, right? Which we hadn't really seen too much of before. Just something to note. 20 minutes from my house through the woods by the quarry and across the highway is Holland's Pond, a remarkable piece of shallowness where I like to go at sunset and sit on a tree trunk. Holland's Pond is also called Murray's Pond. It covers 2 acres of bottomland near Tinker Creek with 6 inches of water and 6,000 lily pads. In winter, brown and white steers stand in the middle of it, merely dampening their hooves. From the distant shore, they look like miracle itself, complete with miracle's nonchalance. Okay, what does she mean here? That the steers, which is, I believe, like a type of deer kind of animal, look like miracle itself. So this is an allusion, maybe you're catching it, to the biblical story of Jesus allegedly walking on water, to that miracle. So because this pond is so shallow, it looks like the steer, when they're standing in it, are actually standing on top of the water. So that's what she means when she says it looks like miracle itself. And then she adds, with miracle's nonchalance. I think what she means there by the fact that miracle has a certain nonchalance, not caring, is because in all of our myth, all of our stories, our culture, religion, etc., miracles are usually happening to laymen, to the average Joe who's not really expecting it, right? So just like you wouldn't expect, you go out in your backyard, maybe there's one of those man-made lakes back there, right? To see, large animals looking as if they're suspended on water. It's like, oh, this is happening in my backyard, right? Could happen anywhere to anyone. That's usually part of a miracle story. It could have happened to anyone, right? So that's what she means by the fact that miracles seem to have a certain nonchalance, not caring, like whatever, could happen anywhere. Moving on. Now in summer, the steers are gone. The water lilies have blossomed and spread into a green horizontal plain that is terra firma. That means solid ground in Latin. That is terra firma to plodding blackbirds and tremulous ceiling to black leeches, crayfish, and carp. This is kind of a cool image. The idea that you have these 2 separate worlds and probably consciousnesses living in each world that are unaware that the other exists, right? So what she's saying here is that the lily pads that grow on top of the water, on the water surface, they're the ground to things like birds, dragonflies, etc., stuff that lives in the air on the land, right? It's the bottom of their world, the floor. But unknown to them, the water lilies are acting as a ceiling, the top of the world, to those creatures that live below the surface of the water, right? Like the fish and the crayfish, whatever. So that's kind of an interesting idea, that you have beings that are unaware of the other's existence, right? You know, kind of also maybe like a womb-like image, because, you know, whatever consciousness is growing in a womb doesn't conceptually know that it's going to be born, that there's more to the world, right? So I don't know, just a really interesting thing to think about. Anyway, moving on. This is paragraph 4, by the way. This is, mind you, suburbia. It is a 5-minute walk in 3 directions to rows of houses, though none is visible here. There's a 55-mile-per-hour highway at one end of the pond and a nesting pair of wood ducks at the other. Under every bush is a muskrat hole or a beer can. The far end is an alternating series of fields and woods, threaded everywhere with motorcycle tracks, in whose bare clay wild turtles lay eggs. So this paragraph brings up another topic that is kind of, you know, threaded throughout, and something that we'll talk about again in this unit, and that is the relationship between nature and mankind. We typically think of ourselves as separate somehow from nature in our culture, especially Western culture. We have parks and designated natural areas that we visit, right, that we go to, you know, on holiday vacation, whatever. But they're not really separate from our world, right? And we're starting to see repercussions from us thinking that we are separate and controllers of the natural world, right? Using it for our own purposes, for consumption, manufacturing, etc. We see how it affects our quality of life, air quality, water quality, etc., global warming, etc., right? So she brings this up, that this, you know, where she saw something that looked like a miracle and all of these natural, amazing creatures is not that far from her house, right? And we certainly know about that in Florida. There's no shortage of insects and iguanas now, right? So same kind of a thing. It raises the question, are we really separate from nature? How separate are we? How separate can we pretend to be? And what is the benefit of breaking down that illusion that we are separate, right? There's some benefit to us probably. Okay, moving on. This is paragraph 5. It's the bottom of the first page of text. So, I had crossed the highway, stepped over 2 low barbed wire fences, and traced the motorcycle path in all gratitude through the wild rose and poison ivy of the pond shoreline, up into high grassy fields. Then I cut down through the woods to the mossy fallen tree where I sit. This tree is excellent. It makes a dry, upholstered bench at the upper marshy end of the pond, a plush jetty raised from the thorny shore between a shallow blue body of water and a deep blue body of sky. So there we have another image of 2 separate worlds, but both part of the same, right? You have the sky reflected in the water, both blue, similar to that lily pad image, I think. So, moving on. The sun had just set. I was relaxed on the tree trunk, ensconced in the lap of lichen, which I think are like little mushrooms that grow out of a dead tree usually. Double check. Watching the lily pads at my feet tremble and part dreamily over the thrusting path of a carp. So she's having this very romanticized, dreamy experience in nature so far. A yellow bird appeared to my right and flew behind me. It caught my eye. I swiveled around, and the next instant, inexplicably, I was looking down at a weasel, who was looking up at me. A weasel. I'd never seen one before. Wild before. He was 10 inches long, thin as a curve, a muscled ribbon, brown as fruit wood, soft-furred, alert. His face was fierce, small, and pointed as a lizard's. He would have made a good arrowhead. There was just a dot of chin, maybe 2 brown hairs worth, and then the pure white fur began that spread down his underside. He had 2 black eyes I didn't see any more than you see a window. So there's the weasel, right, finally. She's reflecting on this experience that she had where she saw a weasel. Again, not a particularly beautiful, elegant, natural creature, but it was close to her and just sort of popped up out of nowhere, and she had this experience, took her by surprise, right? This is paragraph 7. The weasel was stunned into stillness as he was emerging from beneath an enormous, shaggy, wild rose bush 4 feet away. I was stunned into stillness, twisted backward on the tree trunk. Our eyes locked, and someone threw away the key. Our look was as if two lovers, or deadly enemies, met unexpectedly on an overgrown path when each had been thinking of something else, a clearing blow to the gut. So this is a nice metaphor comparing this sense of startling shock to the meeting of two lovers unexpectedly or two enemies. Really interesting how you can make that comparison and have us understand that it's a similar feeling. This is something that we don't really think about that often, but I think it's true that feeling of intense fear or anxiety, it creates the same physical sensations in the body as excitement would, or happiness, right? You get that intense heartbeat, maybe some nausea, you start to sweat, right? So physically in the body, even though we have different things obviously going on in our minds for something based in fear versus something based in excitement, it has the same physical sensation. So if you can get curious about that sensation in the body the next time you feel anxious about something, it can be a good way to break through some of that anxiety, lessen it, and be less afraid of the fear itself, right? Because it has the same trademarks, it has the same feeling in the body, right? So that's how that metaphor is working, even though those things seem on two opposite ends of the spectrum, same kind of sensation, right? It was also a bright blow to the brain, or a sudden beating of brains with all the charge and intimate grate of rubbed balloons. It emptied our lungs, it felled the forest, moved the fields, and drained the pond. The world dismantled and tumbled into that black hole of eyes. If you and I looked at each other that way, our skulls would split and drop to our shoulders. But we don't. We keep our skulls. So, he disappeared. Okay, so she seems to be suggesting that this type of really intense connection can really only happen with something that's the other, a wild creature maybe, right? That this can only happen in nature, this kind of intense experience where you see something and something sees you and you don't have language to talk about it, and it's a very raw, intense experience, right? She seems to suggest that it doesn't really happen that intensely between humans. Like, we would just explode if it did, right? It would be unbearable. So that's kind of interesting to think about. I don't know. Have you ever had an experience like that? I would say leave it in the comments below, but I don't know if you'll be able to. So hold that thought. Anyway, moving on, he disappeared. This was only last week, and already I don't remember what shattered the enchantment. I think I blinked. I think I retrieved my brain from the weasels and tried to memorize what I was seeing, and the weasel felt the yank of separation, the careening splash down into real life, and the urgent current of instinct. So what broke the beauty of this intense moment? She started thinking, right? Our human brain can't help itself. We have to think about it, to rationalize it, to put it in context. We overthink and think intensely about things, right? Whereas nature, as we saw presented in the first part of this essay, acts only according to instinct. It kind of skips that step that we really fall into the trap of and really spend most of our time in, I think. This is the ego. This is self-awareness that so often prevents us from living our best lives. We are our own worst enemies, right? So that's what she's saying. Yes, my thinking human brain kicked in, and then we broke our connection, and I lost the moment, the enchantment, right? Where for a brief moment I was living without myself, without, thinking about me and what's going on with me in my life. The ego, the center, kind of dropped out, which is an amazing experience to have, and you don't need to make eye contact with the wild animal to do it, right? There are meditation experiences that you can have, certain drugs, not that I'm saying you should do them, but I have heard certain, hallucinogenic drugs LSD, etc., can give you that experience as well. Again, I'm not saying do it, don't do it actually, but I'm just saying that it's possible for the brain to have that experience without a weasel. This is just the catalyst for her experience of this, which was obviously transformative, spiritual, etc., right? All right, moving on. He vanished under the wild rose. I waited motionless, my mind suddenly full of data and my spirit with pleadings, but he didn't return. Again, she returned to that space of overthinking. And then also, as the Buddha would warn us, all of life is suffering. We attach, we want. She says her mind did go there. Her spirit was full of pleadings, probably thinking like, oh, come back. I want to see that again. Or what's going to happen next? Can I find him again? I want to, so things that we want take over our every action and reaction, right? And if we're not aware of them, that can really degrade the quality of our experiences, right? All right, moving on. This is paragraph 8, I believe. Please do not tell me about approach avoidance conflicts. I tell you I've been in that weasel's brain for 60 seconds and he was in mine. Brains are private places, muttering through unique and secret tapes. But the weasel and I both plugged into another tape simultaneously for a sweet and shocking time. Can I help it if it was a blank? So yeah, that's what she's saying. They, brains usually are full of, she calls them secret tapes. If you've ever laid awake at night, replaying conversations that you've had or thinking, I know I'm going to say next time to that person, planning this monologue in your brain. You know what she's talking about, right? But she says for a moment, there was a raw connection. Herself, the ego, those worries, that part of the world disappeared, and she had this raw, beautiful, intense experience only, right? Only what was coming into her consciousness. There was no filter of the mind, no chatter, right? Which again can be a really amazing thing to experience. And I'm going to be honest, I have a meditation practice, and it only happens for me in like brief seconds. Some people can hold on to it for much longer. Some people who claim to be enlightened say that they never fall victim to falling into the chatter, even though they can hear their mind going. They never get absorbed by it. Never happened to me. I'm still in there, I'm still staying up at night thinking about those things that we all think about. But it's really refreshing to even have a glimpse of it. So something to think about and maybe consider pursuing or working towards, right? Annie Dillard thinks so, but she needed a weasel. Where are we? Paragraph 9. What goes on in his brain the rest of the time? What does a weasel think about? He won't say. His journal is tracks in clay and spray of feathers, mouse blood and bone, uncollected, unconnected, loose leaf and blown. So she's thinking that a weasel's consciousness is different from ours in that maybe there is no central ego that things coalesce around, that we're always bouncing things off of and thinking about and are overly concerned with. Maybe there's just this space, right, of emptiness that is actually freeing, right? It's just instinct. What's the next thing that I need to do, right? Which again, is freeing to live that way without always having to retreat and think about who's going to judge me for that. Should I do, guessing, second guessing, etc. Anyway, that's where we're going to stop today. And you should have the next video recording of me reading the rest of this piece available to you to watch if you choose. However, just know that you do have to finish reading the entire essay for this week, week 2, and there should also be some activities, assignments to go along with this essay in this week's module that you're to be completing. All right, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you guys are staying well. I miss you guys, and I'll see you soon in another video or chat or message. Bye, guys.